Hello, everyone, whenever and wherever you are. Welcome to our Manna Church High Point's online messaging. As we always say, thank you so much for letting us be a part of your life, and we're just so glad that you have joined us today. I want to welcome you and invite you to go to our website, especially if you're new to Manna's online messaging. Go to our website, hit the Connect tab. You can find all of that in the information below there, and let us know. Let us hear from you. Let's get connected together. Fill out a Connect card. Also, we want to invite you, if you would join us regularly to worship with us in your tithes and your offerings, you can hit the Give tab and just follow all the prompts for all of that. And so thanks again for being with us today. Let me start off a little different than I normally do. I'm going to start off with a little story. There is a story about a little young boy who's maybe 6 or 7 years old, and he consistently and purposefully refused to do what his mother asked, just a little bit defiant. And so in an effort to modify his behavior, his mom placed a chair in the corner of his room and made him sit in the chair facing the wall for a little bit of timeout time. And after sitting there for a minute, he turned around to his mom and he said, "I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside." We're going to get back to that. We're in the final week of a series called Guardrails, and we've borrowed this series from a pastor by the name of Andy Stanley, and taken the framework of that and just kind of made it our own. And for those of you who are just now joining us, we're using the guardrails that you see on a highway, on a bridge, on an exit ramp, and we're using that as a metaphor of how to guard our hearts and how to walk with God and how to walk with other people in a reasonable and a godly way. And so let me just define what a guardrail system is out on the roadway. It's a system that's designed to keep vehicles from straying or driving, keep you from straying into dangerous areas of the road. And the main thing about a guardrail is where it's placed. If you're driving on a bridge, obviously we say this every week, but if you're driving on a bridge, you don't want the guardrail right on the edge of the bridge so that if you hit the guardrail, you're off the bridge. No, you place the guardrail in the safe areas of the road so that if you hit the guardrail, it might cause some damage, but very minimal damage, and it spares your life. So taking that imagery, and of course, you can't just take that and then apply it to your life and your heart. For us, a guardrail is a standard of personal behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. It's a behavior you decide on. We're going to talk about some guardrails, and we've been talking about guardrails, but like we always say, you can take these guardrails and apply them to your life, standards of behaviors. You can add to these guardrails or take away or not use them at all. But what we do encourage you to do is to put some guardrails in your life. And if you hit these standards of behavior, again, they're set in safety zones of your heart. So if you hit that guardrail, it lights up your conscience. The guardrail is not sin. It's indicating to you that you need to change your mind in your direction so that you don't cross the line and drive off the bridge, breaking God's commandments, hurting someone else. And so guardrails are a standard of behavior that keep us. There could be some damage if you hit it, but it's very minimal. And most of the time, almost always, if you hit a guardrail, you can recover from it. So we need guardrails. We need guardrails, and we've talked about this. We need guardrails in our marriages. We need guardrails of how we treat other people, especially our spouse. And we need guardrails in how we navigate our parenting. We need guardrails financially. We talked about those last week. We need guardrails professionally. We need moral guardrails, things that if we're headed towards something that's immoral, as we get close, something beeps, something goes off in our conscience. It's a light, it's an alarm that says, hey, if you keep going in that direction like someone who's naive, then what you're going to do is you're going to drive off the cliff, and you could ruin your marriage. What's take decades to build the trust you can lose in a moment by violating and just blowing through the guardrails and then blowing through God's commandments. So the point of guardrails is for you to come up with a standard of behaviors, but those behaviors are not to be legalistic. They're the warning signs, and they're things that you implement in your life, not to be more holy or to earn God's favor. At the end of the day, the reason we're encouraging you, and my wife and I, as we've talked about, we've set these up in our personal lives. We've set them up in our marriage. And of course, we have hit guardrails before, and they've lit up our conscience. But fortunately, and by the grace of God, we haven't blown through them so that we've driven off the cliff where our lives are irreparable. And so we do this because we set these things up not to be more holy, and again, to get God's favor, but because in our heart, we love God. And we don't want to offend Him. We don't want to violate Him. It's not about, hey, I just don't want to break His commandments. No, I understand the nature and character of God, and from my heart, I don't want to be like that little 6-year-old who's just doing something external to conform to God's laws, but in my heart, I'm rebelling. And so we're not putting these things up, these guardrails in our lives, so that everybody thinks we look good or that we just don't want to cross the line of behavior. No, we want to do it from our heart, from our motive. And that's what we're talking about today. We want to have behaviors in our lives that light up our conscience so that we can be pleasing to God because we love God. So let's talk about what may be the most important guardrail in this entire series. In fact, it really is, because everything we've been talking about really relates to this, and that is, how do we establish guardrails? And this is it, to guard our heart. A subtitle of this may be out of the heart. In other words, everything originates here and emanates out. So let's look in the book of Proverbs. And when you open the book of Proverbs, which is written by a king by the name of Solomon, the Bible tells us one of the wisest men that has ever lived, what you find is not just a very smart man or a wise man expressing his wisdom to the world. What you find actually in Proverbs 1 verse 8 is a father crying out and appealing to his son. So these Proverbs are not guardrails and commandments so much just generically out there that we impose upon our lives so that we can do things right. No, it's an appeal of a father to his son to learn from his own mistakes or what he's learned so that the son can avoid unintended consequences. Proverbs 1:8 says, "My son, you hear this, my son, hear the instruction of your father." So in Proverbs 4, verse 23, which is really our key verse for the day, this King Solomon says this. He says, above all else, guard your heart. Now, Solomon wrote hundreds of different proverbs on hundreds of different topics like work and marriage. He wrote proverbs on sex, sibling rivalry, parenting, economics, immigration. I mean, he wrote proverbs on everything, just about all kinds of topics. But he says, but here, above all else, in other words, you can look at all that other stuff, and all that stuff is important. But if you can only do one thing, if you can't do all these other things, above all else, do this one thing. Above all else, he says, guard your heart. And that's pretty fascinating for the wisest man in the world that knows how to do stuff and be successful, at least in the eyes of people who are watching him. He says, look, you can be successful in all these things, and the world celebrates you and praise you. But I'm telling you, in the midst of all that, above everything that you could possibly do, guard your heart. And then he goes on to tell us why. Why above everything else should we actually guard our heart? He says, because everything, that means everything you do flows from it. Everything you do flows out of your heart. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything flows from it. Now, what if that is actually true? Now, think about that. That everything you have ever said, everything you've ever thought, everything you have ever done originated from the motive of your heart, right there. Now we're not talking about Not talking about your physical heart, but what if it's actually true that everything you do, everything you say erupts from within like lava spilling out of the volcano? And if it's true that all of our actions are simply a reflection of what is in our heart, then our heart then becomes our source. It becomes the motive. It is the reason why we say and do everything we do. And this is what the Bible tells us. Unlike most of the medical field, and I'm not saying all the medical field, most of the medical field is trained to deal with symptoms. And unfortunately, that's what we do. We try to modify our behaviors without having a heart change. And unlike the medical field that just deals with symptoms, Solomon encourages us to deal with the source, to actually deal with our motivations, the why of our actions, and all of those things reside in the heart. He says, deal and pay attention to your heart. Now, we come to another king. His name is Jesus, and we come to the Gospels, and we find that Jesus reiterates this same thing in a different way, the same thing that Solomon says. So I want us to go to Matthew 15. If you have a device, all the scripture, we'll do all the work for you. It'll be on the screen. But I encourage you to get your paper Bible out, get your Bible out on your device, and look through this. But let me give you a little context before we get into Matthew 15. Jesus is going to deal with this issue of external doing versus the motive that produces what we do. Excuse me. In the Old Testament, let me give you a little context about what we're about to read. In the Old Testament, Moses was commanded by God to make a copper laver and place it at the entrance to the altar area of the temple, so that Aaron, his sons, and all the priests after them could wash their hands before approaching the altar to offer sacrifices. If they did not wash, they would be considered unclean and defiled. So as soon as they're coming into the altar, there's a laver full of water, and it was required by law that Aaron, his sons, and all the priests wash their hands before they'd start ministering to God. It was a ceremony. It was a law that they must do. If they didn't do that, they would be considered unclean, defiled, and unworthy to approach God. Now, over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, what was law for only the priest, the washing of their hands, actually in Jesus' day became a tradition in the Jewish home. That before eating a meal, everyone in the home, all Christians, so to speak, all Jews, all the congregation, before they ate a meal, they had to wash their hands. Anyone who did not wash before eating would be considered unclean, defiled, and unworthy. This was not a law from Moses, but it was a tradition that the religious leaders over time imposed upon the congregation. In other words, there was an external action that was required, and if they didn't do it, no matter what was in their heart, no matter what their motive was, they were considered unclean. So in Matthew 15, some Pharisees see Jesus' disciples eating without washing their hands, and it just blows up their mind. This is very offensive to them, and they come to Jesus in Matthew 15, verse 1. It says, "Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, 'Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?'" Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. They're violating. When I was a kid, and I'm sure it was the same with you, when I was a kid, and my parents, we were all sitting down at the dinner table about to eat. My parents, almost every single night, because we're kids, said, "Did you wash your hands?" And I don't know what it is about kids. They don't want to wash their hands. They just want to start eating. And they would make me, and almost every time I go, "No," and I have to go and wash my hands. We did that. My parents made us wash our hands because we know about germs. But in Jesus' day, washing hands wasn't about germs. It was about spiritual defilement. And it was a very, very serious thing. And it was deep in the culture. And everyone understood this. And everyone obeyed this tradition that was almost elevated to the level of law. Being clean had nothing to do with the heart. Your inner man or your motive, being clean, had everything to do with external things you did, the washing of your hands. In other words, regardless of whether you wanted to wash your hands or not, whether you were standing up on the inside like the 6-year-old kid, but you were conforming on the outside, as long as you washed your hands, no matter what the condition of your heart was, you were considered clean or unclean. So in verse 7, they ask him, why are your disciples eating without washing their hands? Verse 7, Jesus responds. He says, you hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips. They honor me with their lips. They honor me with their externals. But their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Jesus basically is saying, tradition is not law. You are wrongly teaching, you religious leaders who are trying to rebuke me, you are wrongly teaching that defilement and uncleanness is based on what you do rather than what's in your heart. In other words, it's not what you eat that puts a man at odds with God. It's what's in his heart. And isn't that really the issue as we walk with God? So Jesus then, after he says this and kind of embarrasses the Pharisees and they walk away, the Bible says that Jesus turns to the crowd and says this. He says, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. Now, to us who are on the other side of the cross, and to us who have read this before, we know this. We know that it's not what goes in us, not what we eat or eating with unclean hands that defiles us. But in Jesus' day, people did not know this, and this was blowing their mind. The Jewish people, to them, this was radical, radical, radical stuff. And in fact, it was so radical that at first, when Jesus is saying this, they just really don't understand what he is actually saying. We understand it, but they don't understand what he's saying, and neither did his disciples. I mean, everyone, Jesus says this, it's not what goes in, but what comes out that defiles, what comes out of the mouth, actually. And everybody's like, yeah, I understand, but not really. And they're probably saying to themselves, oh, yeah, I see. If what I eat doesn't defile me, and eating with unwashed hands doesn't defile me, but what comes out of my mouth is what defiles me. Is he talking about throwing up? Is he talking about being sick? Okay, that kind of makes sense because throwing up is kind of gross, but kind of that doesn't make sense. And wait, I don't understand. And so the people really still don't understand. And we know this, that even the disciples didn't understand, because then Peter comes up to Jesus privately and says this in Matthew 15:15. Peter said, hey, Jesus, can you kind of explain this, what you're saying to us, this parable? We really don't understand. And Jesus looks at Peter and goes, are you still so dull? And I think he's kind of laughing maybe. And he says, are you really, basically he says, are you so dull? Are you really that slow? Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth, what you eat, goes into the stomach and then out of the body? What Jesus is saying is just blowing their minds. And they just really don't understand. So Jesus, he's breaking it down for Peter and all the crowd. He says, let me just say it real slow and let me make it real plain. Jesus says, now follow me. When you eat something, you swallow it, and it goes into your stomach. They smile and go, right, yeah. Okay, yeah, we got that part. Then after a little while, it leaves the body, right? You eat it, and then it leaves the body, the latrine. They go, yeah, we got a little TMI there, but okay, yeah, we got it. Yep, we got it. Then Jesus gets to the point. He says, so you eat. After a little while, it leaves you. But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. What goes out of the body is eliminated, but what comes out of the mouth, not what goes in, but what comes out of the mouth, comes from inside, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft. Wow, these are strong things. False testimony, slander. These are what defile a person, Jesus says. but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. Jesus says, defilement actually begins with a thought, evil thoughts. And those thoughts originate in the heart, not the physical heart, but the spiritual element that's on the inside of you. And then he details some of these evil thoughts. And notice that these evil thoughts play out into actions that we do. Murder, adultery, sexual immorality, which means sex before marriage, any sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman. Jesus is calling it immorality, and adultery, theft, stealing, false testimony, slander, lying. Notice all these thoughts become actions that do what? They hurt people. So let me say it like this. What puts us at odds with God aren't the things, what puts us at odds with God are the things that puts us all at odds with other people. What offends God is what we do and say that hurts other people. God says, this is what defiles you. When you murder, when you commit sexual immorality, when you lie and you hurt other people and puts you at odds with them, you actually are defiled, and that puts you at odds with me. I mean, does murder hurt people? Does adultery hurt people? How about immorality and theft? How about lying about people and slandering people? I mean, if we've learned anything from the political, racial, and COVID tensions that we've all walked through over the past 2 or 3 years here, if we've learned nothing, we should be learning this. You better pay attention to what you say. In other words, you better guard your heart. Because from your heart, whatever you've said, good or bad, has come out of your heart. Because what you say can blow up your career, lose close friendships, divide a nation, and more sadly, divided local churches. So Solomon didn't say, and Jesus doesn't say, guard your words. He says, guard your hearts. Because what you do and say originates there. It's the most important thing. In other words, when you say or do something unpleasant, take a look at your heart and ask, where did that come from? Now, we've all said stuff we wish we hadn't have said. But instead of justifying it, getting defensive, it doesn't matter if that person almost deserves what you say. You have to examine, where did that come from? And was I trying to correct them? Was I trying to help them? Or did I say that to really just try to hurt them? So I want to talk about 4 emotions today. So now that we understand the heart is the most important thing. What you do is important because it hurts people. But if you do something that hurts somebody or say something that hurts somebody, you got to come back and go, I have a heart condition. I need to deal with that area. That doesn't mean every area of your heart is defiled, but there's an area of your heart you have to deal with. I want to talk about 4 areas, and there are more, but I want to talk about 4 that maybe come up in us the most often. And when we have these thoughts, when we have these thoughts and we have these emotions, it should light up our conscience. So I'm not saying these emotions are sin. What I am saying is that when these emotions rise up in us on the inside, before we say something and actually put action to what's in our heart, let us say, when these emotions come up, they're actually our guardrails, and they should light up our conscience and say, hey, we better do something before I drive off the cliff. Because if you don't, you will hurt someone and you will hurt yourself. But even more importantly, it'll put you at odds with God because it will hurt and offend Him as well. So before we put action to these emotions and drive off the cliff, we need to repent. We need to change our mind and change our behavior. 4 emotions I want to talk about that we are headed. And again, when you experience these emotions, I just want to reiterate, when you experience these emotions, you're still in a safe zone before you do anything. That's the time to do something. When you feel guilt, when you feel anger, when you experience greed, and jealousy. Those 4 things. In fact, you may not actually feel greed, but you can identify it. And when you feel and identify these 4 emotions, pay attention to your heart, because that means you have some work to do. That means you're hitting a guardrail. You have some work to do with God and with the Holy Spirit. So don't ignore it and just go, oh, that's just who I am. That's how I was raised. That's how my family. Don't justify it. Don't dismiss it. When you experience guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy, you are running into a guardrail, and everything on the inside of you should say pause and stop, because you're in a safe zone, and don't step over and cross the line. There's something in you and me that has the potential to produce chaos on the outside of us. And our tendency, here's the thing, our tendency is to wait until we have said something or done something. We have the emotion, and then we just jump into it, and then we want to correct it and apologize, and that's what you need to do. But that's putting the guardrail in the danger zone. Before you step out, let's hit the guardrail. So let's talk about what these emotions are, and then what we should do with them. Guilt. So this is going to be up on your screen. Guilt says, I owe you. That's what guilt is. I owe you something. I owe you an apology because I took something from you. When I said this or did that, I took maybe your trust, or I took maybe your respect that you deserve, or maybe I took your honor. And when you carry guilt, and when you do that, you feel guilty because you know you've hurt someone, you've done something, you've taken something from them, you've put something on them, and you carry this guilt. And when you carry guilt, if you carry it long enough, it'll put up walls in your relationships. It'll cause you to be inauthentic because something's on the inside of you that you're carrying and you know you need to do something with. It'll make you dishonest. It leads you to secret keeping. Maybe what you did is just something you've taken from God. Maybe you've taken His purity, you've taken His holiness. Maybe you've crossed the line in those areas and you feel guilty, but you hold on to it, and you're carrying secrets. And when you carry secrets, when you carry guilt like this, your spouse and your friends, they're going to notice something's off with you. It's just going to come out, and they're going to go, what's wrong? You say nothing. Oh, what's wrong? What's nothing? How long are you going to be like this? For the rest of our marriage, for the rest of our relationship? It's carrying something, and it always seeps into our relationship. Guilt. Secondly, anger. When you experience anger, basically what you're saying is, you owe me. Guilt says, I owe you. But when you get angry, you go, you've done something to me. You owe me. You hurt me. You took something from me. You pay me back, or I'll pay you back. You blocked me from getting what I wanted or what I thought I deserved, and now I want it. I want it back, or I'll get back at you to even the score. That's what anger is. Anger leaks. It leaks on to other people who aren't even the cause of our anger. Anger says, you owe me, and until you pay me back, I will hold this thing over you and anyone else who reminds me of you. I've done that. You've done that. You're angry about something else, and someone else gets in the way, and it triggers you, and you take out this thing that someone you feel like owes you, and you take it out on them, and you pay them back. Anger doesn't just hurt the person who took something from you. It hurts the people around you. Greed. If guilt says, I owe you, I owe you. Anger says, you owe me. Greed says, I owe me. I owe me. We talked about this last week. Greed, Andy Stanley defines greed as the assumption that what I have is all for my consumption. It's just mine. As much as I know that you have need, my heart goes out to you, but I just can't bring myself to give you what I have. That's greed. Greed puts our stuff as a higher priority than people. Greed says, I need now, and I need later. And if there's anything left, maybe I'll give to the needs around me, but don't count on it. I owe me. Jealousy says, life owes me. Life owes me. Somebody got what I deserve. She got that promotion that I deserve. He got that raise that I actually earned and worked hard for. And now when you see them, when you feel that way about someone, now it's hard to actually engage with them in an honest way, and it's hard to navigate with them and look them in the eye. You know, jealousy is called the green-eyed monster. It's just so icky and sticky, and it's just hurtful and hateful. And you know what's gross? And I know it's gross because I've experienced it. It's when I find myself secretly celebrating someone else's loss or failure. If that happens, it should set off every alarm in your body. So when guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy rise in you, you need to know you're hitting a guardrail in the safe zone. Bible doesn't say that those things are sin. It's saying what we do with those things, how we act on those could be. And before you act on it, while you're in the safe zone, you need to do something about it. You need to deal with it. So what do we do with guilt? What do we do with guilt? Guilt says, I owe you. You know what we do? We have to confess. That's what you do with guilt. You confess. Now, this is the hard part. You do need to confess it to God. That's easy. The hard part is you need to confess it to a person. And not just a person who isn't in your life very much, some stranger, someone that I haven't seen for 20 years and they don't really care what I do, and I'm going to confess it to them, and they go, okay, whatever. No, you need to confess it to the person that you've taken something from, that you've hurt. Or at a minimum, you need to find someone that's close in your life to confess that to. See, real healing comes when we do that. It might initially hurt your marriage when you confess. You might confess it to someone that's close to you, and it might hurt your reputation, but it will release the grace and the love of God on your life. It will release the healing balm of God in your heart and in their wounding. Secrets suck the life out of you. If you can't confess to the person you hurt, then confess to someone who is in your life that can actually help you with compassion, but also with truth. They're gracious, but they hold your feet to the fire. They're truthful. Confession is where reviving or revival and refreshing thrive. What do we do with anger? We have to forgive. Listen, if you don't know God and you're listening to this, even if you don't know God, you don't have to do these things, but I'm telling you, if you will do these things, it'll make your life better. Because regardless of whether you believe in Christianity and follow Christ, these are things that are true and will free you up. It'll bring freedom in your life. But let me say this. If you are a believer, you have to do these things. These are not optional things. All through the Bible it says, confess your sin to one another. Pray for one another that you might be healed. And if you're angry, we have to forgive. We know there's hundreds of scriptures Jesus talks about forgiveness. Forgiveness is when you identify what was taken from me and then saying to that person, you don't owe me anymore. Do you get that? Someone's hurt you, and now they owe you. But then you look at them, and maybe not face to face, maybe not in person, but in your heart you say, you don't owe me anymore. And it's not just saying, oh, my mom and my dad or my boss was bad. Maybe they were. But you need to specifically identify what they took from you. And once identified, then say, you don't owe me that anymore. I'm canceling the debt. That's what forgiveness is. And when you think about forgiveness, listen, I understand this. We all go through this. We think, look, if I forgive them and I cancel their debt, I'm just letting them off the hook and letting them off of the consequences that they actually deserve. Yep. You're letting them off the hook. But you're also letting yourself off the hook. And by forgiving, you remove the anger that is looking to be vindicated. And when you let it go, it doesn't follow you into the next relationship or existing relationships. What do we do with greed? We give. Oh my goodness. How do we combat greed? We give. Andy Stanley says we need to write some big to you checks. It's an amount, write a check, that's an amount that may not be big to someone else, but it's big to you. The way you destroy greed is by giving. You know, if you identify, and Jesus said there's many forms of greed, but if you identify a form of greed in your life, find something that is precious to you and give it away, or sell it and give the money away. Be someone who owns property and not someone who is owned by property. Don't be consumed. Listen, as a believer, don't be consumed by something that's not even yours to consume. Now, jealousy. Now, I want to take a minute with this. Now, jealousy says, life owes me. Life owes me. I deserve, I've earned, I've worked hard. Life owes me something. And it didn't give it to me. Life owes me something. But if we're really honest, if we're really, really honest, we don't believe that life owes us. We believe that God owes us. When someone has or gets what you feel you deserve, they are not the real issue. The real issue is with God, because we live our lives with a God who is sovereign in our life. And He's involved in our life. And what we're really saying is, God, I deserve this, but you've been unfair to me. You're not doing what you promised you would do. You're not doing what you're obligated to do for me. We have all seen stuff happen to people that they didn't deserve. Say it's not happening to you, but you've watched. You've watched tragedy and things come to people that they didn't deserve. They're faithful and who greatly suffer, who experience great loss. We've seen people like this. And when you get around them, you find that they're not bitter and they're not mad. They've been through the fires of life and they don't smell like smoke. Instead, they're giving God thanks. Instead, they're offering back to God whatever they lost. They just give it back to God as a sacrifice. And those are the people that we respect the most. Not the person that lives in their jadedness, not that person that lives as a victim of circumstance or a victim of what they feel someone has done to them. No, they offer all of those emotions, that jealousy, back to God as a sacrifice. So what do we do with jealousy? We celebrate. We say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. We celebrate. Celebrate God, what God has given you. Celebrate what God gives to others even more. You feel like, hey, I deserve that, but they get what you deserve. You want to combat jealousy? Then celebrate their win. In fact, write them a note. Do something. Sometimes you can do something. Write them a note. Go, hey, Johnny boy, just want to congratulate you on the promotion you got that I actually deserve. No, don't write that. But the promotion that you got, I rejoice with you and celebrate you and proud of you. Way to go. Celebrate. Get it out. Listen, sometimes with all of these emotions, I'll tell you, I do this. My wife does this. Listen, we've been doing it for years. We've guarded our heart. I've looked at a lot of our friends that have fallen away from God, or some of our friends that we've known for 30 and 40 years, and they're not walking with God again. And my wife and I, we get on our knees and we go, God, why are we still serving you? Why is it that you've preserved us? Why are we still here doing this? And I'll tell you, we've done a lot of hard work to get before God to guard our hearts. And that's not a boast. I'm just saying, life should have taken us out a long time ago. Sometimes you feel these emotions when you feel guilt and anger and greed. You just have to say something out loud. And I encourage you to say something out loud. Say, guilt, I'm not living with you anymore. I'm going to confess and fill in the blank. I'm going to confess my sin to so-and-so. You're not taking hold of me, guilt. No. I'm confessing my sin. When you feel anger rise in your heart, just say, no, anger, you can't have your grip on me. I'm not carrying you around. I'm going to forgive so-and-so. Greed, you are not my master. All I have belongs to God, and I belong to Him, and you will not be my master. I'm writing some big to me checks. I'm giving stuff away. I'm giving something away. Jealousy, anger, greed, you can't have me. Jealousy, stay far from me. I'm thankful to God. What I have, everything I have, He's provided for me, and He owes me nothing. The Lord gives to me, and the Lord takes away. God is my portion. God is my inheritance. I bless so and so. I bless them. Solomon said, above all else, guard your heart. I want to encourage you to do these things. As a believer, there's really no other option than to live with them inside here. But if you'll release all these things, if when they come, again, if you run into these emotions, you're not running into sin. You're running into a guardrail, and it's alerting you before you say and do. Get with God and work it out. Do some work. It's not going to take 30 seconds to do. It might take you 30 minutes. It might take you a few days or a couple of weeks. But don't act on it. Get it. Let God do the hard work and guard your heart. Listen, really excited about our series that we're beginning next week. This concludes our Guardrails series, and if you haven't watched all the previous ones, listen, not because I think we are great or our messages are so great, but these are great messages that will help you in your life. We're starting a series next week. I'm not going to tell you everything about it, but it's going to lead us right into Easter, and it's going to be celebrating the victory that we have in Jesus' cross and his resurrection. Can't wait to be with you next week. Love you. God bless you. If you have any prayer, let us know. See you next time.
And now I know that this